All right, ladies and gentlemen, so welcome back. We are going to continue our discussion on cell structures by talking about your cell wall first today. So cell walls are only present in eukaryotic cells when we see plant cells. So although you do see cell walls in prokaryotic cells, the structure is definitely different. When we look at eukaryotic cells, though, we don't see cell walls in animals, but we do see them in plants. Regardless, that cell wall structure is there as a rigid protective covering. It really is going to be important when we start talking about cell transport, osmosis being more specific. As water continues to rush into cells, cells like plants that have that cell wall allow that cell to take in some excess water without blowing them apart. So it provides them this extra protective coating, this rigid coating, so that they can be in areas where water can be rushing into the cells without allowing the cell to take in too much. When we get to animal cells, the fact that they lack that cell wall is going to become a bit of a problem depending on the kind of environment that they find themselves in with that idea of water balance. So that's going to come back. Something else you should be aware of when we talk about cell walls is the fact that these cells are made of cellulose. And remember what that means. That term there ends in that OSE, right? So we have this OSE ending. All right, that tells us that this is a carbohydrate. Okay, so a lot of the sugars that the plants are going to be making for themselves when we talk about photosynthesis later this year, they turn those sugars into things like cellulose as a structural component. All right, so let's talk some energy organelles here. So we're going to talk chloroplasts and mitochondria. And your chloroplasts, note these guys are plant only. All right, so only organisms who are capable of going through photosynthesis will contain these chloroplasts. So the whole point or the whole function to chloroplasts is to be the site of that photosynthetic process. So we're going to take in energy from the sun and we're going to convert it into the chemical energy that the plant cells will then use for other metabolic processes. Specifically, they're going to ultimately turn it into glucose. So we're going to come back to later this year talking specifically about how your plants do that. But for now, just know we take solar energy and make glucose out of it. And we do that through the process of photosynthesis, and that's going to happen here in the chloroplasts. If you take a look at some of the structure here, right, we've got a double membrane system going on here. They do have their own ribosomes, they do have their own DNA. Remember that these guys are part of that endosymbiotic theory, right? We think that these bigger prokaryotic cells ate these smaller ones, and that's how we ultimately evolved eukaryotic cells. And some of the things that we point to are that double membrane system, the fact that they've got their own ribosomes, the fact that they've got their own DNA, so on and so forth. We do find chloroplasts in things like your plants. We also find them in some protists. Some cyanobacteria also have a sort of modified chloroplast as well. And so these guys are all major primary producers in our ecosystems. If you take a look, okay, we see that outer membrane is smooth, the inner membrane is all folded into these little discs. An individual disc is called a thylakoid, and then the whole stack is a granum. Start taking a look at the fact that these things exist, these terms exist for the structure of this chloroplast. The more you can learn now, the easier life will be for you in a couple of weeks. Um, but for now, you just need to know what a chloroplast is, be able to identify it, know its function, know it exists in those plant cells. When we get to talking about photosynthesis, then you're going to be required to know all of that internal structure for the chloroplast, because that's going to be important for how we talk about the way photosynthesis actually works. So if you can pick up a couple pieces now, it'll help you out a little later on. And same thing goes with your mitochondria. So again, we see a smooth outer membrane, folded inner membrane, and then inside that is what we call the matrix, which is probably what would have been the cytoplasm of that prokaryote, if in fact that endosymbiotic theory does in fact hold up, which it seems to as far as the information we have at this point. They also have their own DNA. They also have their own ribosomes. Um, this inner membrane, just like we saw in those thylakoids in the chloroplasts, these cristae or cisternae, depending on who you talk to, are really pretty cool because it's going to increase their internal surface area. We're going to see that that's going to become really important when we get to the processes of photosynthesis. And in the case of mitochondria, these guys are the site for cellular respiration, all right, where we're going to take that glucose and convert it into chemical energy in the form of ATP. Notice this is a really big thing. Circle this, highlight it. I've got it here multiple times. All right. This is really important that those mitochondria exist not just in your animal cells, but they also exist in your plants. All right. A lot of kids will sort of get to the point of understanding that photosynthesis happens in plants, photosynthesis happens in those chloroplasts, and then they go, all right, well, if plants equal chloroplasts equal photosynthesis, then that must mean mitochondria equals cellular respiration, which equals animal cells. You're only halfway there. All right, the sugars, the glucose that those plants are producing via photosynthesis, they use their own sugar that they're making in their mitochondria to make ATP, because that ATP is the energy that they need to do all sorts of other cellular work, moving organelles around, moving things in and out of the cell, so on and so forth. So plants have both mitochondria and chloroplasts. Got that? Plants have both. Animal cells only have the mitochondria. All right. So the plants are capable of using their chloroplasts to make their own sugars by photosynthesis, and then using the sugars that they produce for themselves, aka their producers, right, to go to their mitochondria and make the energy, make the ATP. But animals are going to have to eat that sugar, eat that glucose from their environment, right, either by eating the plants themselves or eating an animal that eventually ate the plant. We've got to take in that glucose in order to go through cellular respiration to make ATP, right? We are consumers in the sense of animal cells only having the mitochondria. So hopefully you follow that, okay? Again, starting to learn some of the structure of that mitochondria now is going to help you when we get to photosynthesis and cellular respiration later. All right, so for now, what do you need to know? Mitochondria are the site for cellular respiration. They exist in both plant and animal cells, and be able to recognize what this looks like in a picture. If you can start picking up on some of those inner structural components in both this and those chloroplasts, that will help you out later, but you're not required to know them quite yet. All right, so we've talked a couple of things that are plant only. Here is something that's animal only. And these things are called centrioles. And they kind of remind me of Twizzler bites. All right, they're actually part of your cytoskeletal structure. They're made of microtubules. Okay, remember those are those sort of tube-like structures that are part of your cell support system. And these centrioles exist in pairs, and we will use these to organize your chromosomes when we get to the point of talking about cell division. So when we get to mitosis and meiosis later this year, and how we take genetic information and move it around so that when we go to make new cells, those new cells have enough genetic information to function, your centrioles are going to be what kind of organizes all of that. So we'll talk about them as microtubule organizing centers or spindle fiber organizing centers when we get to cell division in a couple of units. But this is the idea here. These guys are animal only. All right. When we look at your plant cells and they go through the process of mitosis, they actually use component proteins that are part of their cell wall and cell membrane structure to move their genetic material around, their DNA around. Animals don't have that cell wall structure, so they're going to have these centrioles instead. Okay, so if we look down kind of a run rundown list of things that exist, plant versus animal, you'll see a lot of overlap. Most of the structures are capable of existing in both a plant and an animal cell. Plasma membrane, nucleus, both types of endoplasmic reticulum, your ribosomes, vesicles, your Golgi apparatus, mitochondria, right? Those are all things that are going to be in both. If I run down the plant list and just highlight a couple things that are unique to them, right? Chloroplasts are plant only, cell wall is plant only, and that large central vacuole is plant only. The animal cells are capable of having those smaller vacuoles, things like food vacuoles, for example, or we talked about those contractile vacuoles that also exist in some animal cells. But that big central vacuole that is pretty predominant in most plant cells is a plant only thing. If I go over to my animal cell, what's unique to them? All right. Well, they can have flagella. They don't have to, but they can. Those centrioles are definitely animal only. Lysosomes also animal only. We could also add the contractile vacuole and the food vacuole to this list as well, if those cells are capable of making them. Not every animal cell will have them, but they're capable of being there. So if I look at just some diagrams here, again, these are just one of many types of diagrams you may see of an animal cell and a plant cell, but it gives you a pretty good consistent idea. You will notice in both pictures there are a handful of things here that you aren't responsible for, especially in that plant cell. Things like these Druze crystals you don't need to know. Um, Amyloplasts, we haven't talked about those. That's not something you're responsible for here at this point. Um, but they do a decent job of showing you. This doesn't necessarily mean this will be the exact diagram you see in other worksheets or you see in your textbook or you may see in a test question. So make sure that you're seeing and understanding what these components look like so that you can understand and identify them in any diagram you may come across. The other point here I want to make before we kind of wrap up this part of the notes is the idea that these are models, they're diagrams. They are shoving everything possible that could ever exist in that plant or animal cell that they wish to show you into one picture. No true plant or animal cell really looks like either of these pictures. Um, there is a lot to be said about form and function, right? So, what is that cell required to do in that organism? And as a result, they will have more or less of certain organelles in order to do their job. So, just keep that in mind.